Good morning, Dr. Silberman. How's the knee?
Did you just have a brain fart?
I know Taekwondo.
Stop eating my sesame cake!
You're killing me, Smalls.
Fuck with me, and we'll see who shits on the sidewalk.
Come quietly, or there will be trouble.
Clearly, I wasn't talking to you, big titties. You cherub-looking motherfucker.
While you were still learning how to spell your name, I was being trained to conquer galaxies.
The real question is, what are those?
Part of the reason why I wanted to talk about style, and I wanted to broaden it out from just visual art to just style in general, as it relates to, you know, movies and TV, but also different genres, comedy, horror to some extent, fashion, photography, etc. Of course, couching much of it around visual art, but part of the reason why I thought this was interesting was I can remember back in the 90s when I first became acquainted with the guys in Gaijin Studios here in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And I remember them, at the time, they were really doing exciting stuff. And the thing about it is they would make reference to certain artists from the previous guard as having an 80s style. And that was the first time I had ever really thought about the idea that that art styles within comics would be marked by a particular decade or an era, and that we might move on from that. So the art styles of a John Buscema or John Romita Sr. or Neil Adams and a host of others coming out of the 70s would change going into the 80s with people like, John Byrne, Michael Golden, George Perez, and others. And then, the 90s would be a different thing, and then the 2000s, I guess, would be a different thing. And so, the idea that style, do styles have a shelf life? Are some styles timeless and evergreen? Are some styles so uniquely their own that they transcend the era from which they were birthed or first moved to the fore of culture and public consciousness. And the same thing too, like with art movements as well, do some of those things last. And I also think about someone like a guy like Phil Noto, who when he came along, Phil was doing his style was kind of like
a Robert McGinnis and
like a McGinnis or a Mike Ludlow or an Austin Briggs, kind of an illustrator style from many decades ago, the golden age of illustration. But put through this filter, what if one of these guys was working in modern day comics and was doing comic covers? And I remember loving Phil's his Birds of Prey covers and other things that he was doing. And it's almost like is it Basquiat or Basquiat?
Basquiat.
Basquiat. It's like Jean-Michel Basquiat said it was their older style going through his new brain.
Exactly.
Yeah, like a filter where it's not quite exactly the same, but it certainly, falls within, a similar. Anyway, and so I just wanted to kind of bring it to you guys and just see what you all thought as far as styles go and how well they age, sometimes how well they don't age, or how they don't age well, etc.
Well, it's funny that you brought up the 90s, you know what I'm saying, because when I was in my late teenage years, and really, like you were mentioning with Gaijin and those guys, really following and being an adherent of, especially Adam Hughes and Brian Stelfreeze, and starting tentatively to see where those influences were coming from. Like with Stelfreeze's stuff, you definitely have that Leyendecker influence. There was a point in like the mid to late 90s where it was just there, like just overbearing, But at the time, I didn't know who that was. So when I went to art school, I started going back and like, oh, that's who that is. Same thing with Adam Hughes. There was a guy in my class, when I was at the Art Institute, he said, well, Adam Hughes is looking at this guy named Alphonse Mucha. Who? Who is that? So I went to the library. Then there's a big old book in the school library at the Art Institute of Mucha stuff, and that light bulb went off again. Oh, so these guys are looking at older artists and doing that in their current work. I didn't heretofore. I didn't even realize that was a thing. You know what I'm saying? Because I had been weaned on like the 90s, and the image boom and Jim Lee and all that good stuff. You know what I'm saying? So to me, when I look back on that 90s stuff,
good stuff.
Hey, some of it is still pretty okay, but it has aged itself to a degree. However, when I do look at some of that Gaijin stuff, like I mentioned from the mid to late 90s that, Hughes and Stelfreeze and others were doing, that seems to hold up pretty well. You know what I'm saying? A lot better than some of that other 90s stuff that I was, just so engrossed in. And I wonder if that's because it has a foundation based on like these past masters, so to speak, really, having laid the groundwork for these guys to build upon, and you can't help but to have a solid foundation of stone to build this new house on. So it's going back to your what you were intimating of that old style going through a new mind. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly, Adrian. And to add to that, if I can add to that, it's right. It's style for substance for style. So I think if you have a solid foundation, ultimately the product's always going to be a little more timeless and age better than if you're just a flash in the pan. You do this really, really crazy, frenetic style that has no basis in reality. And when I say reality, I know it's something people actually besmirch and look at it upon as being, Bigfoot style versus rendering versus, your classical, well-rendered, well-studied artists, and look at it with a kind of a certain kind of disdain because they think I'm putting down these other artists or because I don't necessarily care for those artists based on my own personal affectation. But I think that a lot of ways it's an indicator of age in terms of generations, and also indicator of whether or not how well the artist adapts to things. Like you look at one of my favorite artists of the past, for example, as you mentioned, John Buscema earlier. We're talking about John Buscema, and you reading that stack of Conans you got on your desk, man.
Yes, sir.
I think about my exposure to I think my awakening in terms of comics in a lot of ways, and what they could be was Serpieri, man. Serpieri blew me away, dude. Granted, I go way back into the black and whites of Garcia, Luis Lopez, and all the great Filipino artists from back in the day with Conan the Barbarian and so on and so forth. But when I think of the first time I actually saw Morbius Gravis in heavy metal for the first time, I was like, wow, this is what it could be. It was a whole nother level of storytelling, man. It was granted, it was for mature audiences only, but at the same time, there was a degree of sophistication and line work that I don't think many artists of the 90s or the 80s in that particular time were actually utilizing.
Yeah. The 80s then, yeah.
But, go ahead, Adrian.
Well, I was just going to say that a thought crossed my mind, D. You were mentioning Serpieri, and also when you first brought up this topic, Swain, you were mentioning about Mobius and about how certain artists, their particular style seemed timeless, even though they were burgeoning in the 70s and 80s. You can read them today, and they still seem just as fresh as they did when they first premiered. And I don't want to make a generalization, but I find that amongst like a lot of the European artists, that's especially the case. You know what I'm saying? Like when you do look at Serpieri or Mobius or those guys, and I wonder if again that's because there's more of an artistic tradition there in the European, sense, rather than in America where it's kind of fad based and more really based upon, in my opinion, the social mores of the time.
What's being said about
what I'm
companies,
saying?
yeah.
Like, yeah, exactly. Or like stuff that did start in like the late 60s and early 70s here, it's still feels like it's from the late 60s and early 70s when you look at it now. And I'm not saying that to be, like all offhand, but okay, like the point I brought up was, somebody like Bob Peak. Now come on, we all love Bob Peak. That's a master right there, you know what I'm saying?
True that.
But when you look at his joints from like, okay, in the last years of his life, through like, I say 91, 92, he was still working, right? And so I have an illustration magazine issue that has, some of his pieces from the latter parts of his life, up until the time of his death. And unfortunately, a lot of that stuff still looks like it's from that 70s period. Yeah. Very pastels, airbrushes, it's just like, it's almost like he found his formula and he couldn't evolve from that, or that's what he was known for doing. You know what I'm saying? And you find that with a lot more with American artists, so to speak, than European artists. I'm not saying that it's across the board true, but I wonder if there's a correlation there between having that foundation of art versus here in America where it's not as strong. We have it, but it's not as strong. You know what I'm saying?
I would say, Adrian, that even though I think you're making the comparison is, and your points are kind of valid. It's a little unfair to compare the European tradition to the American tradition. One, because America is just a little over 200 years old.
Yeah.
So we're not pulling from hundreds and hundreds of years of art tradition, hundreds and hundreds of years of training and a different attitude towards art, like the Europeans are, or like let's say like in Japan, where it's 1,000, maybe 1,000 years, that you're pulling from. So I think it's very different in that regard, in terms of the attitudes and just the really rich history that they draw from. But I think also too, some of it has to do with the attitudes as well. Like Dee was saying with Serpieri. These attitudes about art and what art can be and how valuable it is to society. I mean, we're over here, and so we probably have a certain kind of a romanticized view of, how Japan thinks of manga and anime, and how the Europeans think of art and how they esteem, sex and nudity within art as not being this kind of tawdry thing, but actually something, that's a celebration of the human form, and the human nature, sexuality being a component of that. But I don't know if, like what you were saying about Peak, the other thing is Peak as an artist. Let's look at a contemporary of his, the very great but recently late Mark English.
Yes.
Okay. So they both worked in illustration. They both worked in advertising. So Peak was drawing and creating images for the day, for the time, for the moment, for a product essentially to be sold that day.
Right,
then
commercial,
and
product oriented things.
And yeah, and Mark English was the same way for many, many years until he stepped away from illustration and then started basically doing fine art. And then you saw a very different Mark English come along in terms of the kind of picture making and mark making that he was doing, and he really became. I said this on the previous iteration of SiDEBAR, and I'll say it again here. I had seen those TV guide covers and those illustrations that he had done for magazines, etc. I'd seen them. I didn't know who that was. The Mark English, the name Mark English that was associated with the images that I became a fan of was the latter day Mark English. It was the paintings of Native Americans and and horses and colorful landscapes. That's the Mark English that I knew by name. And then I went back and realized, oh, this is the same guy who did, Time Magazine, Newsweek, what have you. And anyway, it's an interesting thing, but I think, those guys working in advertisement, it was just a very different thing to compare to, and still doesn't. I'm not saying your points are not valid though.
No, I get what you're saying, you know what I mean? And, even with the example that I, was mentioning about Pete, he was still doing like, not junkets, but like stuff for movies. Like, his bread and butter was like the movie poster from like the early 70s on through to like the end of his life. And those couple of examples that I'm thinking about in like 91, 92, he was doing, movie poster work, and some of that stuff I noticed in the description beneath the picture, it said unpublished or unused, So I wonder if in a way, he was hired for those jobs because he was the one of the premier, poster artists of the time. They were just like, well, we got to at least bring him in, see, what we can get, from him. What are his thoughts on this, And I wonder if, by that time you have someone like a Drew Struzan, coming in, and a lot of other poster artists of that ilk, you know what I'm saying? By the time from like the early 80s through really even beyond that, really taking over with more of a photographic painterly approach, you know what I'm saying? I'm very photorealistic versus the more impressionistic art.
With the flourishes. And,
exactly. And again, I wonder if that's one of those societal mores that started to enter in art in general during like the early 80s. Like you see that in not just the movie poster work, but arcade cabinets, magazine illustrations, this very, very tight photorealistic representational style, really starts to enter, the consciousness in American illustration commercially, around that time. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of, that's a hallmark of a lot of 80s work that I see, and appreciate. I love that.
Do you think a lot of that's because of the fact that the market, like the comics market seems like always kind of like a base for some reason for science fiction and fantasy oriented things, and then things kind of spring from there into other aspects of representation as far as illustration goes. For like, think about it. Travis Charest went from being the poster boy for Wildstorm to doing album covers and things like that, and really spinning off and really stretching himself, becoming this whole other artist after he left Wildstorm. And I think in a lot of ways, I think the commercially viable element of what something is becomes the new indicator of what style is going to be. Like you were saying, with Bob Peak and Drew Struzan and artists of that day, back in the day when you interviewed Drew Struzan, he was like, people were doing knockoffs of Drew because they could afford him, and he was even still around. So I think that the market will always try and gear itself towards those things which are most successful, and try to duplicate what success is, because there's so much riding on their investment in it. So I think a lot of times when we see a style, it's really just, when it comes from a commercial perspective, it's people just trying to make sure their overall business venture is as successful as possible,
Well, let me ask you this then, D. Since you bring that up, as it more relates to like some of the the great masters, like if you look at Bernie Wrightson, if you look at Mike Kaluta and Windsor Smith and Jeff Jones, those guys. But like, for instance, Jeff Jones was, after a while he started painting, and he was drawing from, that romantic period, that European romantic period, in his work, where I forget the artist's name. I don't know why I'm all of a sudden blanking on his name.
What, Waterhouse?
Waterhouse, yeah. Is it Waterhouse?
Yes.
Yeah. Where his work started to look, quite a bit similar to, to Waterhouse, And even Jeff Jones went through a period where he started to look very Wyeth-esque in terms of some of his paint strokes. You know, and you know, like there are art movements that you can point at, you know, which it's still, in a way, it's like an industry. I mean, there may not be a film business that's hiring these people, you know, 150 years ago, but, you know, the Impressionists of the 19th century, Cezanne and Mary Cassatt and Degas, the Expressionists, Munch and Van Gogh and Kandinsky, and even, you know, Klimt and people like that, you know, who are considered symbolist painters. You got to think that in some cases those styles become popular, and if you're a fine artist, you know, you're gonna maybe try to get in with those folks and ape those styles, because that's what, you know, that's what people are putting money down for. You know, maybe an exception might be like Egon Schiele, who was actually an acolyte and a mentee of Gustav Klimt, but he still falls in with those Austrian, you know, painters of that particular period.
No, I told.
That wasn't a question. I don't know what that was.
No, it's a very salient point, man, and I agree with you 100%. I think that it very much is an act of acceptance amongst your peers to some degree, and acceptance and being able to get some point. Here's the once your art makes an impact upon a social dynamic, you have two choices. You can either do better than that, or you can join the club. So a lot of times it's like easier to join the club than try to reinvent the club. You know what I mean? Because you're trying to be able to provide for your family and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's one thing to be, I am an arteur, I'm an avant-garde artiste, and to be broke and be hungry. You know, so you can either get on the bandwagon and join the club, and then eventually work inside the confines of what's there to express yourself, like Bill Sienkiewicz did, or I would even say like one of the newest artists of note. I would say he's kind of like not a new artist but an older artist, Brian Froud, with he's doing Dark Crystal now, and which is very good, by the way, too, guys. It's much better than, I mean, I love Jim Henson. This is still Jim Henson, but this is because of that long form storytelling we can have now. It gives you a much greater breadth to explore the world, and nothing's forced. It feels like it's all natural and evolving naturally, and it's just it's a visual feast, and it's all like done by Jim Henson with Brian Froud at the helm of designing the characters and the creatures. Anyway, I digress. But my point is that in terms of style, and I think his style now is coming back into vogue for that particular realm of fantasy. And you're going to start seeing a lot more of what he's doing being implemented now, or being aped, if you will, inside of comics and fantasy books.
Now, you bring up an interesting point, D. You know, you were talking about providing for, you know, an artist, you know, kind of adjusting with the times and styles to provide, you know, a career and, you know, and support for their family and themselves and so forth. You know, one of the notable examples that I can think of off the top of my head is like Herb Trimpe and also Don Heck. Like a lot of those guys that were mainstays in the 70s in comics, you know, just like everyday
Frank
workers.
Robbins.
You know, every month. Exactly. Every day.
Blue collar.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was looking for. You know, you knew every month you're going to get Incredible Hulk by Herb Trimpe, or, you know, whatever by Don Heck, so forth down the line. Come the 90s, it was dictated to Herb Trimpe. They were like, look, you cannot draw like how you used to draw. Rob Liefeld is hot now. Jim Lee is hot. If you want to work for Marvel now, this is like the early 90s. This is like 92, 93. They were like, look, you got to draw like them, or we don't have anything for you.
Wow.
And when you look at it, there's examples online of him adjusting his style to this, and it's painful to see.
It's almost akin to hip hop, where, you know, the style now is, you know, like everybody's kind of singing and rapping now. Everybody. There was a time when that was not the case, where, first of all, ne'er shall the two meet, and if they do meet, you can sing on the hook, but you're not going to sing in the verses. And then I really blame like 50 Cent and Ja Rule for kind of bringing in this whole kind of singing and rapping at the same time. And now everybody does it. Travis Scott does it. Drake, everybody does
It's
it.
like, no, you need to choose one. Oh, I can't stand that
but
shit,
here's the
man.
thing. I can almost forgive him for that, but that damn auto-tune has got to go, partner. It's got to go.
Oh, and then they could buy all three. Oh, my God. It's so funny. My daughters and I will be in the car, and I'll be like, I got the perfect rap song for y'all. I know what y'all listen to. I only have to turn the radio on. It's going to be some singing, some mumbling, and then it's going to be some auto-tune. Some dude talking about, oh, gee, yeah, oh, you know what I'm saying? It's like, what the fuck is that? Come on, man.
Well, now here's the thing. Now, we were weaned in a different era, but even now, like for me, I listened to Jay-Z's last record, 444.
Oh, damn, he came out double. I didn't even know that. Go ahead.
No, it's not new. I mean, this is the one that came out a year or so ago.
Oh, after what was it, Magna Carta or whatever it was?
Yeah, well after that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rockefeller, y'all.
Yeah, but like listening to him rap now, it's kind of like he sounds a bit past his prime in terms of delivery. And part of that is because he put out so much material. But I think that, like, even musically speaking, and this actually brings me to another question for you guys, where, for people who do seem to be timeless and whose styles seem to remain at least somewhat fresh, even in the ever-changing landscape of media, visual art, music, fashion, what have you.
Yeah.
I wonder if, like, you look at someone like Prince or Nina Simone or Madonna even, or David Bowie, where, Prince was so forward-thinking in his subject matter, in his lyrics, in his arrangements, even though the technology and some of the sonic palette that he was drawing from was definitely of the late 70s and in the 80s. Even with that, some of the stuff you listen to today, it still sounds fresh. It still ages pretty well. And the same, I think you can say for Bowie, even though some of that stuff, again, the recording techniques were practically, first century or
one track,
first generation,
2 track, 3 track,
4. Well, but like later on in the 90s, when he started collaborating with Nine Inch Nails and he started experimenting with industrial music and other things and mixing other styles, it worked because Bowie was always a comedian. He was always something different. Bowie was almost his own style. He was his own style. As a filmmaker, Edgar Wright is kind of his own style. It doesn't matter if he's doing Hot Fuzz or if it's Shaun of the Dead or if it's Scott Pilgrim Saves the World or whatever it is. He's kind of almost his own style. Like his visual storytelling is so specific where you're going for him, you're not going for what he's doing. And I think, for someone like Prince and all these people, I wonder if they do kind of transcend. And even Madonna, where Madonna was always moving and collaborating with different people and other people. Whether you like her stuff or not, my point is it would make sense that whatever was interesting and whatever was exciting about music, that Madonna would be a part of it, because she was always in the mix of something that was exciting and interesting musically speaking. She was in the clubs in the 70s and 80s, and when dance music changed, she changed with it. And that to her, that's to her credit. A lot of people can't do that. But Madonna has remained a viable musical personality for decades, way past what people ever gave her credit for. And I think that is something that she is to be credited for. And same thing with Nina Simone, where I feel like Nina Simone was kind of always her own thing. Even though she was playing the piano and singing like a lot of people were of that day, her style was such from day one. Her singing style was just like, okay, either you get it or you don't. But it's going to be what it's going to be. And I wonder if that's something that helps with the with you being able to kind of transcend, the here and now. as a style.
Yeah.
I definitely think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there is obviously the correlation to that, to being adaptable to whatever technologies or styles or, change of mode or societal mores come to the fore, in whatever generation that you're still working in. You know what I'm saying? And again, not everyone can do that. Some people try to find their ways. It's like, hey, look, I'm stuck in this mode. So I'm just gonna do nostalgia tours. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
Okay, let's go back to that rap analogy again. That's why they have Rock the Bells festivals. Hey, I'm gonna see all these 80s and 90s acts. You love them. You know who they are.
Wow.
You know what I'm saying? But people flock to them because they know, okay, I'm gonna get my fix of this 80s and 90s shit when I go to Rock the Bells. You know what I'm saying? But you do have some artists out there who were still there in the 80s, but their stuff now is still as good. You know what I'm saying? Or that stuff you listen to from the past is still as good. So there's something to be said for not only being able to adapt and change with the times, but having your material initially be so strong and forward thinking, as you mentioned, that it doesn't matter what generation it's received in, it's just too good or too well done, and still it holds up. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't seem of that time.
Like when
and you can't say that for a lot.
That's true. No, it's true. Like when Michelangelo did the Sistine Chapel, it was game.
Exactly. Can't be topped.
Do more of this. If you can't do this, So it's, that's the kind of thing. You're right. It's about people that are just the cream of the crop, continuing to evolve as cream of the crop. It's just what it is. I mean, everybody's capable to create and to do things, but some people have that extra something that makes their stuff that much better, that much more authentic and part of them, and stand out. I would say like Mike Mignola from the '90s. Mike Mignola's style is so intrinsically his that when somebody else is doing him, even though they're really capable of doing a great imitation of him. I would say who else is like that? Bill Sienkiewicz. Bill Sienkiewicz is still Bill Sienkiewicz for the most part. He slips sometimes, but for the most part, when he does his commemorations, does his memoriams, RIPs, those are always fantastic. Any person that passes away, those are always spot on Bill. What just does it like he does. So to Swain's point, I and both of you guys, I agree 100%. I think a lot of times it's about, like Swain would say, as Swain said in the past, a gift that is so great that cannot be maintained or denied.
Yeah, exactly.
And in comics, Adrian, in our initial exchange online, we were kind of going back and forth about what this conversation could be like. And you mentioned Mobius earlier, but another one is a guy like Richard Corddry.
Yes, yes.
Where even if you go to, even in a book like Heavy Metal, which everybody is trying to freak you the fuck out.
Pretty much.
Nobody could freak you the fuck out like Richard Corddry.
No, exactly.
And even to this day, I'm still like in awe of like, how is he seeing the world? What kind of, 8-pupiled spider eyeball is he seeing the world through, where he spits out the images that he does? Even his most tame, like those Hellblazers he did, or the Luke Cage series that he did, which I enjoy those for what they are, but it's just like, jeez. I mean, you talk about someone who sees the world his own way, and he looks just as interesting and provocative, and he draws you in just as much today as he did 40 years ago.
Yeah.
30 years ago, however long ago it was when he first appeared in the pages of Heavy Metal, and I guess he was in Epic magazine.
He was
too. I'm not sure, but just an amazing artist. And again, I think because he is definitely singing his own song and singing it his way, that's part of the reason why his stuff kind of defies category in a strange way as a visual artist. But Let me ask you guys this: as far as style is concerned, like even with I think it can kind of be a lot harder to be transcendent and to not be boxed in like with television and with film, directors and just filmmakers in general. For instance, with television, every now and then someone will throw a video up online where they'll kind of ape 80s television shows, which had a very specific style in terms of how they came on and the laugh tracks and multi-camera and the way the shows were, the stories were structured, and even down to the theme songs where, in the 80s, the theme song of the show would kind of tell you what the show was about.
Right.
And then we got away from that where that didn't happen anymore, where shows would just come on and they would just...
Yep.
And now, like right now, I wonder how in television, shows like Modern Family and, the now, ended, like Parks and Rec and shows like that, where it's that, in The Office, where it's that mockumentary, shaky cam, kind of confessional, talking to the camera, that style of television. I wonder how that is going to age 20 years from now when people look back on, the 2000 teens and say, oh yeah, that was definitely like 2010 or 2008 or 2015 or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I think that sprang forth from the advent of reality television. You know what I'm saying? I think reality TV kind of gave way to people doing parodies of reality TV starting in the mid to late 90s. When Jerry Springer became popular and then The Real World and all that stuff came on, they were ripe for parody. And as people started doing those parodies, it became its own cottage industry to do TV shows and actual comedies based on those actual type of parodies. And because it's so ingrained in our brain that the type of camera moves that you would see in a reality television show where the incident would happen and then they get like the principles of that incident alone with some backdrop saying, well, I didn't know that was going to happen. If Brad wanted to go out the house, all he had to do was just say so, and then they go to someone else, or just, you know what I mean? And just so now we were so used to it to now it's in our vocabulary. It's in the popular lexicon when we watch media now, how we take that stuff in. You know what I'm saying? And there's a certain style, not only to, those type of mockumentary type of TV shows, but even the way movies are shot now as well. Like with that very desaturated look, there are certain camera moves that I miss from classic cinema that just are not done now. You know what I'm saying? Like that, I forget the technical term of it, but like when like a character notices something on the ground or something that needs to draw our attention to it, and the camera it'll look at it and then zoom in on it like, this is important. You don't see stuff like that, like those subjective type of camera angles and things like that. Now it's just very much desaturated. How real can we make it? This kind of slice of life almost, and it's just kind of, like I said, embedded itself in the popular lexicon of our viewing vocabulary, so to speak.
I agree 100%, man. One of the more interesting experiences going on right now, and you guys may laugh at me for saying this, but, for those of us who remember 90210, the original series, there's a new version of 90210 now. And
I know.
And they're actually aping. They're making fun of their characters as themselves, but while trying to put the team back together to do the show again. So it's kind of
I've heard about
it's kind of an interesting concept. So it's not bad. So you have Tori Spelling being Tori Spelling and Donna. You have David Silver. Well, you have the various characters, whatever their names were back then, doing themselves and being who they are as actual actors and trying to get the job. So it's an interesting thing to see the two worlds collide and how they still make it interesting and entertaining. So not to say that you should watch. Not to say you should watch 90210, but I think there's actually a thing wherein for
no worries.
for those 80s babies out there that were caught up in the mix of what was happening inside the show, because it was there was a moralistic thing going on. There was always some kind of point at the end of the story that says, now, Brandon, you shouldn't do this to your sister, or now, so on and so forth. Wherein there was more, things we had, which wasn't a bad thing. I think a lot of ways we need to really instill some of that back into our society these days anyway, because you see what's happening now because if we don't have that type of situation going on, where you have kind of like the pot leading the pot, and both of them calling each other black, and they're both black. I totally messed that metaphor up, but you get what I'm saying.
No, I do. And I was even telling my daughters, like, you know what you don't see on sitcoms and stuff like that anymore? The very special episode. You remember how when we were growing up, it would be like, and that's a style that's changed too. When you look at a lot of sitcoms and kid shows and stuff like that now, all of them are silly. And not to say that they weren't silly back then, but there was like some goal that at the end of each episode, it was trying to tell you at least something. Something.
Well, that's I think we can kind of blame, if you want to call it blame, Seinfeld for that, Adrian.
Oh yeah, how so?
Seinfeld, very openly said that this was going to be a show where there was no learning. There's no learning. There are no lessons. There's no very special episode of Seinfeld.
Yeah.
It's just these really kind of questionable and in some cases reprehensible people who are interacting with one another. So a lot of things that you see that follow after that are characters. A lot of shows where the characters are kind of unlikable. They're kind of not. They're not great people. But I will say that Blackish has jumped into the realm of very special episodes and specific episodes. And when they changed the tone of the show, for me, it didn't work. It got too serious. It was better when they would handle a semi-serious subject with comedic, with comedic footwork and with comedic, handling it in a comedic way. But when it would turn too dramatic, it didn't feel like the same show, and it worked less for me.
Yeah,
that's just my take on it. But Adrian, I know you're a big fan of films and the filmmakers of the 70s,
yes, sir.
Specifically.
Yes, sir.
And I just wonder if film is something, and film directors can have. If there are any that we can think of that have a classic style or a style that, certainly, if you're shooting cars in the 70s or the 60s or the 50s or the 80s or whatever, and hairstyles and the fashion or whatever, and that's, there's a proliferation of that stuff in your work, then you're going to be marked by that time. But I wonder if in terms of like the camera moves and the types of stories that are being told and even how the dialogue is written, I wonder if there are some examples of filmmakers that seem to age gracefully or age well.
Well, age well.
From then or today or?
Go ahead.
Well, from previous generations to now.
Okay. Man, there's a litany. Like you said, and I'm definitely a fan of that late 60s and I'd say early to mid 70s period. I think that's one of the definite burgeoning points in terms of cinema. Not just in terms of new wave, but in the types of filmmakers and the directors that were doing them. I look at some of the films of like a Don Siegel, who directed quite a few Clint Eastwood movies, like particularly Dirty Harry. He did not direct Magnum Force. That was Ted Post. But Dirty Harry, played Misty for me. A lot of those early 70s thrillers that still hold up pretty well, and because the direction was so solid. It wasn't flashy. It was like, here's the story, here's the setup. We are going to go through this story, and it just works. Another one would be Robert Aldrich, who directed The Dirty Dozen, as well as quite a few other movies. The Longest Yard, things like that during the early 70s as well. And, a lot of directors of that ilk, I think that work holds up, at least the best of it, because there's a technique to it, and it's not so much a flash. Like, okay, for instance, when you look at like a Michael Bay movie, it's of its time. It is. I mean, even though he's done several Transformer movies since then, when you look back at Bad Boys, the first one, it's of its time. It feels like 95. The Rock feels like that 95, 96. You know what I'm saying? Type of feel. You know, as opposed to other filmmakers who like, I can almost watch this almost evergreen. You know what I'm saying?
Okay. So do you think it's sorry to interrupt you? Do you think it's the action movie oriented flicks that are like that, or is it because I think James Cameron's movies still transcend and still work throughout various points of time? I think Terminator with some of the special effects are still kind of iffy at times for the Terminator, but it works. It works because you feel like this is a robot, and robots should move like that. Likewise with Alien or Aliens. I think that movie still it's one of his crown one of his crown jewels, man. So
absolutely.
The well, here's I guess the thing to me would be like one of the things that I notice when I watch old television shows and like old TV movies or even movies from those eras, the storytelling a lot of times it is pretty nuts and bolts in terms of how the camera moves, etc. But at the same time, the pacing is much slower than the pacing that we found in the 80s and certainly in the 90s and now in the 2000s. And kind of like if we're talking about action, I had this conversation with a coworker recently, and where if you look at the Bond movies of the last, the Daniel Craig Bond movies, if you look at, everything has kind of been influenced by the Bourne Identity, and what was it, Paul Greengrass who directed the first Bourne movie? I think it was.
Yes, it was.
I think it was Greengrass. What Greengrass did with the Bourne movies, the very first two especially. I don't think he directed the third one.
No.
And so you see Bond go from this kind of a fantasy secret agent to a real world secret agent. You see Christopher Nolan do Batman, and it is a very real world Jason Bourne kind of a Batman who's driving a tank, down the street. And because of that, you lose some of the fantastic and some of the imagination that one requires for these really outrageous things. Now, strangely enough, you see a lot of that be infused back into the action genre with, I know you're going to be surprised that I say this, the Fast and the Furious, where you see that series go from about car racing and friends hanging out and being in the streets to now it's gadgetry, it's
super agents,
cars jumping, secret agents, and
superhuman, like
Dom is a damn Terminator.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, it's just you see all of that stuff, but you see it kind of working. I mean, again, whether you really like it or not is separate.
Sure.
You see that series becoming something else, and that's really the only place you can find that.
Yeah.
In a consistent mainstream way. You don't find it. Everything else is dark and gritty and whatever.
Now, do you think that that's also a reaction to superhero movies as well? Because that's obviously the other place that you would find like these very fantastic, settings and characters and feats and so forth. And I wonder if people have been starved for those type of scenarios within film for the last couple of decades, for at least the last decade, where everything had gotten very dark and very real. If Batman really did exist, this is how he would be. It's like,
right.
Exactly. Yeah. And people just
pray to me.
Exactly. All I want to do, I just want to see like some dudes flying. I want to see some women shooting beams and stuff like that. And just people, maybe that's a societal moviegoer or just a consumer reaction to, hey, I want more of these fantastic concepts in that media, particularly movies.
That's probably definitely true with the Fast and definitely. Wow.
Absolutely.
I think that's absolutely true with Fast and the Furious, where they saw the success of the superhero movies, and essentially now in the latest one, Idris Elba is a superhero.
Yeah.
Black Superman.
Yeah.
Right. His character Brixton Law.
Right.
Dang.
That's the character's name, Brixton Law, in the Hobbs and Shaw movie.
So you saw it? Did you see it?
No, I didn't see it.
Okay,
It's just I just have read a lot about it, but so it's definitely that. It's superhero movies becoming the new action movies, and thus you see an action movie centered around cars kind of taking on those superhero elements. Mm-hmm. But Marvel definitely, in terms of their style, if you could even call it that, they definitely embrace different genres. Mm-hmm. They're starting to embrace fun and humor. Mm-hmm. Maybe to some people's not caring for that. Mm-hmm. But you see them embracing all those things. The DC movies went more the Bourne route, probably, to a large degree, because of Zack Snyder's sensibilities, where everything is very dark and dour, and there's no real fun element. One of the reasons why Captain America worked, and it was the first Avenger, worked, is because it was not afraid to have heart. Mm-hmm. It was not, it didn't shy away from having heart and wearing its heart on its sleeve. Mm-hmm. This is a guy who believes that fighting for his country is a noble pursuit. Right. It is a noble project of which he centered his life around, essentially.
And ultimately, he's a good man, ultimately, which is what the scientists told him before he became Captain America. He was like, don't lose that portion of you. That's why I want you to take this, to be part of this experiment, not because of what you provide for me physically, but because of what you have inside,
Yeah,
and that's
but I do think that films, even beyond the action genres, I think some of the dramas and everything of yesteryear, I do find that again the pacing is so slow. Mm. It in some cases it is glacial. It is so slow.
Hey! As a fan of TCM, my daughters kid me about. Well, they don't really kid. They make fun of me for it. But right. I watch TCM like nearly 24/7. And they're always like, Dad, you're always watching those black and white movies. And just for me, I find the pacing, yes, it can be slow at times, but I also find it very deliberate, And for me, that kind of works. Well, yes, of course. Yes, obviously. But for me, some of those movies really work. Like you can't have a pot boiler like an Alfred Hitchcock, Now, a lot of his movies are of their time. Let's not kid ourselves. Right. Absolutely that right. 50s, very early 60s. They're of their time, but there's something about some of those movies that remains timeless, And I think for me, it's like I kind of appreciate that. Whereas now in modern cinema, it's like, what's the twist? Mm. It's not even on the Tarantino level. It's like almost every movie now, your dramas is like, I didn't know that was going to happen. Oh my, what? That was the twist? Oh my, okay, it's enough. Not every single movie has to have that, we're going to bend your mind. Oh, you didn't see this coming. Why can't you just have a deliberate drama that just like is a slice of life or whatever it's going to be without having some type of, don't tell anybody the ending of this. They'll never guess what happened. Stop it.
They have those, man. They're on Lifetime Channel.
Yes, Deadly Secret. The closet in my bedroom. Whatever. Yeah. The secret closet. Oh, brother.
Yeah. Do you guys think that, like Adrian's talking about, the deliberate, approach to storytelling and to filmmaking, and just a very, to use my term from earlier, nuts and bolts approach to making things. Do you think that can lend itself to something aging well and something, having an appeal beyond the time in which it's made? In other words, if you incorporate less of the flourishes and the flashiness of the day and you stick to more kinds of strict practical approaches, does that do you kind of escape around being pigeonholed of the time? So, like, I think, for instance, moving back to comics, let's say, or cartooning for a second, mm-hmm. The simplicity that an Alex Toth approached his work with, which, was very similar to what, like, Milton Caniff was doing. I guess he was an acolyte of Milton Caniff's.
Yes.
And, from the newspaper strips. And, Frank Robbins, again, another guy in that same vein. And then you see others all throughout the course of comics who there have been people who kind of did something similar to that. Cliff Chang would fall into that category. Simple, simple line work, clean, expressive, and nice use of drama and all the things that you want, but certainly not like what was happening in the 90s, like with McFarlane and Silvestri and those guys, and the really over the top kind of commercial approach to making comics. And it's very warm to look at. Chris Samnee, it's very warm to look at. Paul Pope, to a certain extent, although his subject matter tends to be a little more out there, but he is basically a cartoonist.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's something that can aid you in not being considered of your time, so to speak, in terms of your style.
Yeah, man. I mean, we have a voice. We have an undeniable voice. It always lends itself to more credibility and helps you in terms of the aging process. The individuals you mentioned are people which are they kind of paved their own path inside the genre they chose to work in. I think of like Pascal Campion, for example. That's undeniably him, man. I mean,
yeah,
his stuff is just like,
absolutely.
I mean, his storytelling, his color sensibilities, the angles he chooses, the subject matter he chooses, the pacing is just marvelous, man. But he doesn't do comics, but I'll buy a comic of his in a heartbeat, because that's just how much I think of his work. When I think of what, the credibility of his narrative ability is. I can't say about every artist. Some artists are really, really good. Really, really good stylists and really, really good visually impactful individuals, but there's no narrative behind it, and it falls flat because there's no verve. There's no real direction to it.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, like people give Michael Bay that same kind of criticism, is that he's all flash in the pan and hard to watch, things of that nature. But sometimes inside of that, you can still find points where he's connecting on a humanistic level that helps to bring all that stuff back together for me personally. I know it's a stretch for some, but for me, his stuff works based on that, And I forget.
I always thought that Bay as a filmmaker, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's cool.
Bay as a filmmaker, if they put him with someone who could give you story and character, you almost have like the perfect filmmaker or the perfect filmmaker team. But it's just, he's just so uninterested in those things. Those things don't excite him. Same thing with Zack Snyder. Those things just don't excite him. And you almost have to say, look, man, like people always say as it relates to, and this is a slight digression, like Godzilla, the new Godzilla movie. Well, I don't turn on Godzilla to get a story. Okay, but isn't the easiest thing to do to write a good story? Like just to sit down with your computer and just make a story that makes sense. To write characters that make sense within certain given situations. That's the easy part. The hard part is drawing the fucking monster and doing post for a year.
Right. You would think.
And it's like, okay, why not say, oh, we're going to make this crazy, awesome, super bombastic kaiju fucking, giant monster movie,
Pacific
but
Rim.
we're also going to have a story.
Right.
We're also going to have characters that people will root for and connect with.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. No.
Now, do you feel like that to a degree? Like, all right, keeping with that analogy, you do have someone like a Spielberg, or, whether you want to admit it or not, like a Lucas, with the first couple of Star Wars movies,
seriously.
and then Spielberg with Close Encounters and, definitely Indiana Jones and those early movies of that ilk. You have like very populist movies that do have a semblance of a story. You know what I'm saying? Now, whether, the story is slight or whatnot, there was still something there in terms of, here's a narrative, and here is this fantastic visual sense and settings and characters to go along with that. And I feel like that filmmakers within that particular genre, that blockbuster genre, have kind of taken that over the decades since and just kind of extrapolated just the fantastical settings and characters and stuff, kind of left that story behind.
Well, if you look at a movie like E.T., for instance, and I'll be real quick. As it relates to what you just said, E.T., the effects don't necessarily hold up. The sequences hold up, and the tale holds up, but the effects don't necessarily hold up. Now it's a lot harder for me to look at the puppet that they created for E.T. and really believe it.
Right.
Yeah.
But that movie was not a. I mean, you can say on the surface, it's about an alien who comes to Earth and makes friends with a boy.
Right.
It's about family and finding a new family. It's about making friends. It's about being accepted because even though you're different.
Yeah.
It was essentially almost like in Huck Finn, where he runs off with Jim and Jim's a runaway slave, and that was illegal. But once he and Jim bonded, he felt like he had to protect Jim. He had to look out for Jim, and it's the same thing with E.T. He had to protect this creature from another planet once they connected and once they bonded. So those are the things that remain that are still, to me, tactile within that film.
Right, exactly. And there are fewer and fewer films, each year that make that connection for me. You know what I'm saying? And I do find myself going back to those older films, kind of regardless of genre, that still give me that, that emotional connection with the story and just everything, the whole package, And so in that way, they remain timeless to perhaps not only myself, but a lot of people who feel that connection and may not have that same sensation or feeling from modern or contemporary films,
Well, I think to your point, I think part of the problem with modern contemporary films and with modern contemporary absorption of content in general is there's just so much out there. We're being inundated by it. We have every channel, we have every discipline, every idea, every concept, every genre at our fingertips right now. We didn't have that before. Before it was an event. I think the event has gone out of things. Wherein if we don't want to buy comics now, we can get them on our iPads and read them on our Kindles and things of that nature, and get the same kind of excitement out of it. I think we're just overly spoiled to the point to where we don't have the need for that anymore. Before it was an event to go to a Saturday morning matinee or Saturday afternoon cartoon or things of that nature. Now it's like, oh, just turn on Cartoon Network. Oh, just plug in Netflix. Oh, let's go to Disney Plus. Here, this is laughable. Let's go to BET Plus.
Busted entertainment television.
But it's happening. So anyway, I can't believe that's even happening. But anyway, that's another conversation entirely.
Well, D, to your point, there are still events, but they've just been franchised out. So a Steven Spielberg movie is not an event, but the fact that they're going to do 4 Avengers movies all at the same time, and they're all going to be connected and they're all going to come out a year apart, that's the event. The fact that maybe they're going to shoot Black Panther 2 and Black Panther 3 at the same time, that would be an event. The events are centered around these huge $100 million, $200 million movies that are franchises that they can sign actors up for 7 years and 7 movies or whatever it is, for multiple films. That's where the event is now, and they spend a lot of money to promote those things.
Sure.
But it used to be the new Steven Spielberg movie was an event. The new whatever was an event. Annie Leibovitz shot the cover of Rolling Stone, and it's
Demi Moore.
It's Demi Moore or Neil Young or Britney Spears or whatever. That is the event. And now it's no longer that way.
Right.
It's the focus has shifted. But I know what you're saying, because this idea that we have so much available and it's on demand. Now even with Star Wars, where I know we all have varying opinions as to what the new Star Wars is, but for a while there we were getting a new Star Wars movie every December.
Yeah.
And so it becomes less of an event to have a Star Wars movie every year.
Yeah. It's an embarrassment of riches, man. I mean, to the point now to where Disney Plus television,
truly, it's a good term.
It's going to have like The Mandalorian coming on in a few months.
Right.
And
Right.
and Star Wars is coming back again in December with the last installment of the Skywalker saga, The Rise of Skywalker. So it's going to be, I think ultimately what it boils down to, man, in terms of artists and transcending or maintaining their style or their style being relevant, is you just got to tell a good story, like whether it's visual or it's narrative in terms of prose assisted or camera assisted or creatively assisted by artists. I think you just have to be able to tell a good story, and I think that's what carries through more than anything. Think about the Donners, man. Think about how lauded that first Superman movie really was, as far as you can believe a man can fly. Think about how dated those special effects are now. But still, if you go back and look at Christopher Reeve's performance, you go back and look at that script. Yeah, it was chopped up. I get it now. We're looking in hindsight. There was supposed to be the two movies. What it should have been one, and so on and so forth. I get all that. But look at the caliber of that storytelling. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have an individual that has been thrown into been taken away from his planet, been thrown into a certain situation. He's forced to grow inside another situation and becomes the ultimate example of human beings should be, even though he's not a human. And that's a curve, a trajectory which you don't go on anymore with any kind of story that I can think of recently, except for maybe the Game of Thrones type situation where people are willing to go on that ride and suspend their disbelief for a long period of time without being so jaded and caught up in the fact that it's not interesting anymore, or this is old hat, or this is trite, or this is the tropes and things they usually go back to and fall back on. So
yeah. Yeah, you're right, and I think you can say that, like you say, tell a good story. I mean, even if you're talking about writing a song, making a television show, a movie, writing a book, what have you, is wanting to tell, having a story to tell and being able to tell it well. But I think also too, like, and let me ask you guys this as we close, but there, like, even within like photography, photographs are very different, even though photographic techniques are different than they were 40 years ago. I imagine the tools of the trade, not the physical tools, but in terms of camera angles and how you engage with your subject, with the lens you choose, lighting, etc. Annie Leibovitz and Herb Ritz and Anton Corbin and even Gordon Parks. A lot of times, they're taking photographs of people in a specific time, and so I wonder if photography as an art form, if the styles can transcend, or do we look at Gordon Parks and we immediately think, that's late 60s, 70s, or do we immediately see Anton Corbin and we think, that's the 90s? I remember when he directed that Depeche Mode video. Or even like with fashion in general and haircuts. The fade haircut was big in the 80s and 90s, and it's back. It's not back in exactly the same way, but it's pretty much back.
Yeah.
The afro came back. It didn't come back like Angela Davis style, per se, but it's back. The mohawk came back. Coloring your hair. Girls color their hair now, the way that they did back in the 70s and during the New Wave era.
In the 80s.
Yeah, pink and blue and green, etc. All of those things kind of come back, and I just wonder, but they don't necessarily come back in the same way. So I think it's a style, but again, it's that running it through a modern day filter and you get something slightly different that comes out on the other end. That wasn't a question. I guess that was kind of a statement.
No, it's good. It's a good statement.
But I think part of it is impacted by the fact that we all can take almost professional quality, photos now with just our phones. The difference being in that those previous generations, you really had to set it up, the lighting, the time of day even. I want to make sure I catch you at golden hour, like right at that 5 o'clock hour when the sun is right here in the sky, so that these shadows are going to fall just like this when it comes through the window. And you got to stand right here, or even that kind of reportage, photography, where you were catching these very candid shots, that somehow indicated a time and place or an event. You know what I'm saying? And just now, you don't have that. I can't even think of very many shots in the news, those, these kind of reportage shots where it was memorable. There's nothing like, the Tank Man from Tiananmen Square. There's nothing like, Kent State, the shootings at Kent State. None of that exists now because we're so inundated and everyone has the ability to take pictures, to the fact where there are no pictures now. Everyone can do it. You know what I'm saying? So I think...
Well, I think you're right, although I think, photography is an art form, and I know you're not saying that it isn't.
Oh, yeah.
But no, what you're saying, with the proliferation of cameras being everywhere, an image could come from almost anywhere. I mean, we've got friends who are photographers. Steve Eberhard is a photojournalist. Kyle Bice is a photographer.
Bernard Wooten.
Bernard Wooten is a photographer, friend of ours, and even Dave Palumbo takes a lot of shots and is really knee deep into photography as I suspect more as a hobbyist, but I mean he's a good photographer, and I do think that there are people who I do know who take a lot of pictures and put a lot of pictures online, and they probably spend a lot of money on cameras, but they, in my opinion, they have no skill as a photographer. They literally do not know how to engage with the subject.
Right.
You just took a picture and it was centered and it was whatever and you caught it at an angle and blah, 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 blah. But you're not engaging with the subject. You're not finding what is interesting about this thing that you're taking a picture of. And it shows. I'm immediately bored by it. There's another guy that I'm friendly with online via social media named Kevin Mellon.
I've heard. Yeah.
Kevin is I think he's a storyboard artist and a cartoonist and an artist, a visual artist in general.
Yeah.
And he works on the show Archer.
Okay.
And he's based here out of Atlanta, but he takes some great shots, and he made a cool short film that I saw online. And the thing that I was struck by immediately is that he has an engagement with subject matter, just in terms of the framing of the shots and what he chooses to shoot, how he chooses to shoot it. I mean, it's there. Like it's a filmmaker's eye, and I'm not trying to blow smoke up,
Right.
gas Kevin up, but I mean, I think he definitely has something if he really chooses to pursue it, and to a great extent. But I don't know. I think as far as style is concerned, it's a very difficult thing to do because style can be very personal. And it's not always everyone's cup of tea. But I do think that it is interesting when my daughter, who was raised on, all the modern shit that, that 12, 13, and 14-year-olds are raised on, she's super connected with The Outsiders. She read the book. She watched, the documentary. She, watched the movie and memorized the dialogue. She had the posters on the wall.
Wow.
And that was a movie that was very of its time. But that was like, I think that was Coppola, right?
It was, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, she and I share a Francis Ford Coppola touchstone, even though, we're decades apart in age, and it was just kind of interesting that she was able to connect with that because, again, it's, that was a film that was of its time, and it was in black and white. What? No, it was in color.
You're thinking about Rumblefish.
Rumblefish.
That came out immediately afterwards.
Don't
One
box me
day
in.
I'll show them just what I made
Love that,
of.
man. Love that. And I'll slip into a brand new skin. And you won't be able to box me in.
That's it.
Oh, man.
Love that. Sorry.
That concludes this episode of Sidebar Forever, hosted by Dwight Clark, Swain Hunt, and Adrian Johnson. You can find us online
at sidebarforever.com. Any emails or questions can be directed to us at sidebarforever@gmail.com. And also, subscribe to us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram. Sidebar Forever is copyright 2019, Dwight Clark, Swain Hunt, and Adrian Johnson.